Wherever I look, I see more and more female protagonists, female major characters, and women-centric narratives, all reaching critical acclaim. Gone are the days where female characters were solely reduced to their relationships to men. Their love interests, their mothers, their sisters, their damsels in distress, their supporting characters there to cheer for them, or die so that they can be sad. Modern female characters are messy, complex, morally grey, sometimes villainous, sometimes sympathetic, and more often all of the above. They contain multitudes. Of course, misogyny in narratives and the fandoms surrounding them are still issues that are far from being solved, but it does feel like certain strides have been made. Even Skylar White, one of the most hated female characters ever, has had something of a renaissance, and the people who watched Breaking Bad in their 20s now look back and feel ashamed of how awful they were towards her. A lot of this is a correction applied after pressure from feminist media criticism and the demand to treat women as human beings rather than narrative resources. Things, however, are still far from perfect. The problems plaguing female characters might have been reduced in intensity, but never quite disappeared. Often, they actually reinvented themselves in such ways that they are more difficult to point out. For example, writers still have problems imagining women having futures outside of the very narrow scope of marriage and babies, or that they suspiciously often die right in the middle of their character arcs or right before their completion. In those instances, you will often be fighting against plausible deniability. Let me simulate the response you will get for pointing this out. Phoenix Ashes thinks that female characters should never die. Phoenix Ashes thinks that female characters can be tragic. Phoenix Ashes thinks that female characters can't get married, and worst of all, can't have babies. Oh, and I bet that Phoenix Ashes also thinks that female characters can't be villains. Yeah, that's exactly what Phoenix Ashes is thinking. Leave your comment and close the tab now. Okay, the adults can start talking. What is it about modern writers and their inability to imagine futures for women? This video contains major spoilers for Game of Thrones, Arcane, Stranger Things, The 100, Euphoria and Yellowjackets, as well as minor spoilers from multiple other franchises I'm too lazy to name. If you end up enjoying the video, consider liking, subscribing and commenting. And if you prefer, you can listen to this on Spotify. It's hard to determine whether men or women die more in fiction. It would be very challenging to find a big enough sample to form a statistical analysis, and we would have to take other problems into account. For instance, on average, there seems to be more male characters. A study performed by University of Southern California's Viterbi School of Engineering concluded that in literature, there may be as much as 4 times more male characters than female characters, though take this with a grain of salt as they used AI for this. If these findings have any reflection in reality, then the sample would be skewed. If we have as much as quadruple the amount of male characters in literature, then of course they have a higher likelihood of dying. This ratio may also differ depending on genres, as a lot of them tend to be male-dominated. Female-dominated genres are still in a minority and obscurity, often treated with disdain and mockery as less serious. Curiously, all of this in spite of the fact that women read more than men. Another study that I found shows a stark disparity in video games. Authors examined a sample of 150 video games in a large-scale content analysis. Male characters represented 85% of all video game characters, with only 15% of characters representing female identities. 41% of the games surveyed did not include any female characters at all. What is easier to measure are certain well-documented contexts in which characters die. For example, we can notice that a great deal of female characters die at the very beginning of the story, or even before the story officially starts, with their deaths serving as the inciting incident for the male heroes to start their journeys. The disposable woman is a broad umbrella used to describe such an occurrence. TV Tropes describes it as such. This character has a familial or romantic relationship with a protagonist, which allows creators to derive heart-wrenching sorrow from her death. Thanks to woman being a unique character trait, character development is not strictly necessary to get the audience mourning as well, so she typically gets little to none. Losing her is often an inciting incident in both standalone and serial works, giving the protagonist a pretext for revenge against her murderers. In a series, she is easily forgotten by the characters, forgotten by the writers, or even summarily replaced. Since it is an umbrella term, we can name several subtropes within it. Wives dying at the beginning of movies is so common that it resulted in several humoristic parodies and memes. The montage of the dead wife at the beginning of movies, many of them receiving hundreds of thousands or even millions of likes, meaning they clearly resonate. The other day I, who rarely turns on the TV, was channel surfing and stopped to watch a movie with Russell Crowe, The Water Diviner. In it, the main character Joshua lost all 3 of his sons in World War I, after which his wife Eliza went insane with grief. The second Eliza appeared on screen, I knew what her fate was going to be, and indeed, maybe 20 minutes into the movie, Eliza drowned herself, which prompted Joshua to go on a quest to retrieve the bodies of his sons. In Gladiator, another movie featuring Russell Crowe in the lead role, the main character Maximus refuses to pay obeisance to the new Emperor Commodus, and for that his son and unnamed wife are killed, kickstarting the chain of events where he becomes the gladiator. In Deadpool 2, a movie particularly dear to my heart because for whatever reason my first ever boyfriend and I went to see it on our first date, Deadpool's entire quest begins after his wife Vanessa is killed. In Nolan's Inception, Cobb's wife Mal committed suicide before the events of the story, and her death results in a narrative obstacle he must overcome. These are obviously just a couple of examples, but the fact that I could watch a movie on a random Tuesday and immediately see this trope coming, and then quickly name another movie with the same lead actor where the same thing happens, proves that this phenomenon exists and is widespread. The issue with this trope is that, in the vast majority of cases, the dead wife is rarely given any integrity beyond what she means to her husband or partner. She is good, kind, beautiful, she made him happy, she was his, and then she was dead. The tragedy was not her lost life, not her lost potential, not her lost future, but the pain it elicited in her husband. It is only her relation to him and the feelings he has for her that matter. She may as well be replaced with a life-sized cardboard. Sometimes she is forgotten in the frenzy of the plot, or even replaced with another love interest. That's exactly what happens in the unfortunate The Water Diviner. A more specific variation on the dead wife trope is a phenomenon called women in refrigerators. This term originally referred to a website created by the American comic writer Gail Simone, describing a situation where female love interests in comic books are met with some disproportionate harm in order to motivate the male hero. Simone coined this term after a scene in Green Lantern, where the titular character comes home to find his girlfriend Alexandra killed and stuffed in the fridge. Simone compiled a list of over 100 female characters from various comic books where a similar script plays out. A woman close to the male hero gets killed and/or seriously harmed in order to motivate him. When fans questioned whether this development is strictly gendered, since male characters in comics also experience death and suffering, one of the editors of the website, John Bartol, pointed out that while male heroes also suffer, their pain is different and has different results than what happens to women in refrigerators. An occurrence he named the dead man defrosting. In the few months we have been batting the women in refrigerators list around, we have invariably bumped up against the question of how does this differ from the plight of the guys? Superman has died, Batman had his back broke, Captain America has been plagued with super soldier complications, the ever lovable thing has always been that ugly orange color. The fundamental difference I have seen is that the majority of male heroes, and especially our dead man defrosting, are introduced to the reader with a situation or condition they must overcome. Female heroes too go through this. We meet them in the beginning of their tale with something about them that will play a role in their formation as heroes. But later, those same women heroes are altered again and never allowed, as male heroes usually are, the chance to return to their original heroic states. And that's where we begin to see the difference. More specifically, that difference is this. The majority of male characters we have seen start their journey through the heroic cycle, for lack of a better term and to borrow from Joseph Campbell, with some challenge or unique condition or even impediment. It is part of their nature. They are introduced with it and must overcome it as a part of them becoming a hero. We all first meet many of the heroes listed in the Dead Man Defrosting as they are undergoing their initiation into the world of heroes, and these initial traits are the result of the events that allow them to be heroes. In cases where male heroes have been altered or appear to die, i.e. hit that part of the karmic hero wheel that says fall, then rise to the challenge, they usually come back even better than before, either power-wise or in terms of character development, relevancy to the reader. In cases in which the hero has died and isn't resurrected good as new, with very few exceptions, the murderous Nut Bar Hal Jordan being the one that stands out, they die an unambiguously heroic, fallen in battle, or touching death. Now, some of us at the Women in Refrigerators have had fans question us for seeing misogyny where there was none, or suggest that we might be overly concerned with looking for unwarranted instances of comics trying to put women in their place. But the Women in Refrigerators and its contributors are trying to point out there is a difference in how male and female characters are treated. Some of this could be implied misogyny, some of it just may be creators playing out story and character archetypes and roles modern society still reinforces. But the fact is that this does happen, pros are recognizing it, some are not happy with it, and we just happen to point it out. Call it a natural and healthy curiosity about the state of comics. TV tropes additionally gives a pretty grounded consideration. Fridging is often given a very negative connotation, as it is all too often a hallmark of supremely lazy writing, quickly hurting or killing an established female character as cheap anger for the male protagonist, and devaluing the life of a female supporting character in the process, instead of giving the villain something actually interesting to do that can involve all three characters and more emotions than simple anger and angst. Gail Simone and others originally spoke of Women in Refrigerators only in the context of comic books, and they were able to name over 100 women. However, fans and critics alike soon noticed that fridging happens in other forms of narrative media as well. In the aforementioned Gladiator, Maximus's son and wife, who is only ever referred to as Maximus's wife, I may add, don't just get killed, but crucified. In this instance, the wife is also replaced by another love interest, Lucilla, though Maximus does reunite with his wife and son in the afterlife. Something similar happens in the TV show Spartacus, where the titular hero defects from the Roman army, for which he and his wife Sura get enslaved and separated. Later, Spartacus's owner Batiatus promises to reward his gladiatorial prowess and arranges a reunion between the couple, but in such a way that Sura is attacked on the way and she dies in Spartacus's arms. Though to Spartacus's credit, even when he has another love interest, Mira, he never quite moves on from Sura. In the movie The Crow, a loving couple named Shelley and Eric are both killed, and Shelley is raped beforehand. But later, Eric gets resurrected by the titular Crow in order to go on a quest to avenge Shelley. In Supernatural, Sam's girlfriend Jessica is sliced across the stomach and bursts into flames as he watches, which motivates him to get revenge. And from what I could gather, Supernatural is apparently quite infamous when it comes to fridging, though I hadn't watched enough of the show to make an informed judgment. In The Boys, Robin quite literally explodes into a puddle of blood in front of her boyfriend Hughie. In Game of Thrones, pregnant Talisa is stabbed repeatedly in the stomach as her husband Rob watches in shock, though in this instance he quickly dies as well. Dead Man Defrosting are also present outside of comic books. Sherlock Holmes, for example, was killed off in The Final Problem, but he proved so popular that Arthur Conan Doyle rewrote the situation so that he survived and reintroduced him in The Adventure of the Empty House. This is one of the most well-known instances of retroactive continuity, shortened as retcon. In Lord of the Rings, Gandalf dies in the Fellowship of the Ring, but later returns. In Game of Thrones, Jon Snow is assassinated by other Night's Watch members, but is resurrected by Melisandre. In the books, although Jon is entering his 15th year of bleeding out at the wall, the consensus among the fans is that he too will be brought back in the Winds of Winter. A fridged woman has the same problem as the disposable woman. She often has little development, complexity, and her own integrity. She exists to be tortured, hurt, and assaulted as extra spice, and her trauma is made all about him. The additional problem here is that her gruesome pain is often depicted in a very voyeuristic way. Fridging did not die in spite of its somewhat reduced intensity, nor is it really in the process of dying. It has adapted and reinvented itself. Women are still disposable to their narratives, but in such ways that the patterns are looser and more difficult to pinpoint. As such, it's easier to maintain plausible deniability intact. But just because patterns are looser does not mean they are not there. And one of the patterns I noticed is that writers still have problems with imagining diverse futures for female characters. By diverse futures, I mean a myriad of things. I want female characters to have happy endings that don't involve children and marriage. I want female villains who stay evil and win, but I also want female villains who get compelling redemption arcs. I want idealistic female characters that achieve their goals. I want bad female characters to be allowed to change and grow, but to also stay bad people. I want female chosen ones. I want female anti-heroes. I want female characters to not be reduced to their singular struggle. I want female characters to not have any romance in the story whatsoever. In essence, I want female characters to have access to the full scope of the human experience in ways male characters have been getting for hundreds of years. Surely, such characters are there somewhere, and we are definitely moving to the place where they will one day become the norm, but I still find the diversity of futures to be severely lacking. And contrary to what you may think, I also want compelling deaths of female characters, but with a caveat. I want them to die if and only if they have completed their journeys. Because more often than not, I find that today's fictional women are subjected to a particularly insidious form of fridging. The glass ceiling is defined as a metaphorical barrier that restricts the career advancement of women and minorities to higher level positions within organizations. According to Julia Kagan, the phrase is commonly used to describe the difficulties faced by women and minorities when trying to move to higher roles in male-dominated corporate hierarchy. The barriers are most often unwritten, meaning that these individuals are more likely to be restricted from advancing through accepted norms and implicit biases rather than defined corporate policies. In addition, researchers described a related phenomenon. The glass cliff is a phenomenon in which women are more likely to be put into leadership roles under risky and precarious circumstances. A study of the 2005 general election in the UK found that, in the Conservative Party, men were selected to contest seats that were easier to win, while women were selected to contest seats that were unwinnable. Furthermore, an analysis of CEO transitions among Fortune 500 companies over a 15-year period found that white women and men of color were more likely than white men to get promoted to CEO when firms were performing weakly. Another study found that, when asked, law students were more likely to assign a problematic legal case to a female attorney than a male attorney. And women are not spared from barriers in fiction either. The most obvious one is that women are still underrepresented. In video games, they are a minority or are not present at all. Secondly, genres where women tend to be protagonists, leads, or constitute a majority of characters or audiences, such as romance, tend to be devalued as vapid and unserious. Thirdly, women in genres or stories that tend to be perceived as masculine, those with male audiences in mind, or in stories where men constitute the majority of other characters, tend to face misogyny in-universe and out-of-universe. Just think of the amount of whinging when it was revealed that GTA 6 will feature a female protagonist. Not even one that you are forced to play as, just an optional one because you will also be able to play as her boyfriend in the year 2137 when this game finally comes out. The lack of diverse futures is yet another such barrier. But what I want to discuss is something more specific. I propose the term the glass finish line. This phenomenon is not at all about the frequency of female characters dying, but rather a situation in which female characters undergo substantial transformative journeys, but are also disproportionately more likely to have said journeys suddenly interrupted by death right before the completion and the integration of that transformation. The hero's journey, or the monomyth, is a common template in stories where a hero goes on an adventure, experiences crisis and tribulations, emerges victorious and returns home changed or transformed. The study of these patterns, inspired by Jungian psychology, was popularized by Joseph Campbell. In his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, He describes the narrative pattern as follows. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. There are variations on the hero's journey, with adjustments, readjustments, and changes of terminology, but it tends to be divided into 3 stages: the departure, the initiation, and the return. In the departure stage, the hero first lives his ordinary life until he receives some sort of a call for an adventure. The hero then ventures into the unknown in order to undergo a metamorphosis. In the initiation stage, he meets a series of trials and tests meant to transform him, often failing some of these, but eventually managing to conquer them. In the last stage, the return, his goal is to retain the lessons he learned during his quest and integrate them to his ordinary world. Eventually, the hero is the master of the 2 worlds, comfortable and competent in both his ordinary world and the magical world he entered, and he receives the freedom to live. The structure of the monomyth has been identified in classic works such as Moby Dick, Lord of the Rings, The Odyssey, and the Chronicles of Narnia. And of course, the monomyth is not without its critics. Not every story strictly follows this template, and Campbell might have been cherry-picking a bit. Feminists also critique the monomyth as overly masculine, and some have attempted to construct the female monomyth, most notably Maureen Murdoch in The Heroine's Journey, Valerie Estelle Frankel in The Heroine's Journey Through Myth and Legend, and Kim Hudson in The Virgin's Promise. What I want to point out is that, although practically none of the characters I'm about to describe meet the hero's journey beat by beat, they all have in common that, suspiciously often, right before they can be fully aware or appreciative of the transformation they underwent, or, in Campbell's terms, they do not experience the return, and they are denied the possibility of internalizing the lessons they've learned, thus never becoming the mistresses of the 2 worlds and experiencing the freedom to live. I saw it claimed that the death of Daenerys Targaryen was what started the recent trend of writers of popular franchises, particularly male ones, killing off their female leads. While I'm not sure if this is 100% correct, I think that fans seeing the connection is not unfounded. For most of Game of Thrones, Daenerys was a protagonist in her own right. In fact, both in the books and in the show, the usual gender dynamics seem to have been reversed. It was men who were dropping like flies to further her story, her brother Viserys, her husband Drogo, her son Rhaego. Without these deaths, Daenerys wouldn't be able to assert herself as a protagonist in her own right and would remain subordinate to her male family members. Daenerys' goals were never tied to having a husband and children, but an ambition that's usually coded as male, reclaiming the throne of her ancestors. In fact, when George R. R. Martin was constructing Daenerys for the original book series, he started with the trope of the monarchs exiled across the waters and quickly found that Daenerys is more interesting than Viserys. Per his own words, he wanted to show her transformation from a scared girl into a powerful woman. If I was to use one word to describe Daenerys' arc, it would indeed be transformation. She transforms from a scared girl sold off in marriage into a woman who emerged unhurt from a funeral pyre, cradling creatures that have been extinct for a century. She transforms from a Khaleesi subordinate to her husband into the first ever woman to lead a Khalasar, who then transforms into an abolitionist, who launches a continent-wide slave revolt, then into a conqueror, then into a queen of a city-state that has to wrestle with keeping the abolishment of slavery intact. Even when stranded on the Dothraki Sea and taken captive, Daenerys emerges from this predicament by transforming into a Khaleesi of the largest Khalasar in the world, finally ready to embark on the journey that would, in her deepest hopes, transform her into the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. And amidst all the things that made Daenerys so unique was that, although she had love interests throughout the show, she was never defined through the romantic lens. In her relationship with Dariona Harris, she was the one in the position of authority, and she was the one who had to enter entanglement for the realization of her ambitions. Even in Season 7, she and Jon Snow met on equal standing, and arguably she held more cards than he did, and was not made subordinate to him. In addition to transformation, another thing that I would use to describe Daenerys would be agency, as the status of Daenerys as the protagonist of her own story was never left up to interpretation. She always actively drove her story forward. She made her own decisions, her own mistakes, learned her own lessons, faced her own problems and demons, and always managed to come back stronger than ever. But something changed halfway through the final season of the show. For the first 4 episodes, Dany remains her agentic self that we knew and loved before. She remained firmly situated among other leads of the story alongside Tyrion, Sansa, Arya, Jon, and the rest of the crew. But in episode 5, Daenerys abruptly stopped being a protagonist and was instead reduced to an object of derogatory gaze. She faces a series of deaths and betrayals, but curiously, we do not have her own insight into her declining mental state. We are told about it. We observe her to the suspicious, watchful eyes of Varys, Tyrion, and Jon Snow. She is presented and spoken about as if she was a moving, talking, and breathing obstacle, and not a grieving human being. Her normal human reactions to the loss of those closest to her are not met with sympathy, but scrutinized from the outside. All of a sudden, Varys believes that Jon Snow would be a better ruler than Daenerys, that irrespective of the fact that P supported Daenerys and knew her for a long time, while he barely knew Jon, and his newfound allegiance is explicitly framed as "cogs are important." At the beginning of episode 5, Varys tries to poison Daenerys, and his specific justification for that is the premonition he has about her inevitable turn, given to him by the writers, because great writing is when the characters know the same things as the writers, and when themes are for 8th grade book reports. Said premonition and the removal of Daenerys' point of view are inexplicably linked together, as you will soon see. Daenerys is framed as morally compromised for acting well within the moral rules of the world she occupies, in which treason and attempted regicide are punished by death. In essence, considered hysterical for defending herself from the obvious threat to her life, after which she's pushed even more towards the role of antagonistic plot device watched from the outside. Nowhere is it more visible than in the defining plot twist of episode 5, when the last time we see Daenerys' face is before her decision to torch King's Landing, after which she is quite literally reduced to a dragon CGI. When she reappears in the last episode, we once more aren't in her head or in her perspective. We are looking at her through the eyes of Jon Snow and Tyrion Lannister. Gazed upon, if you will. All while Varys is retroactively vindicated. All of this is done for the explicit purpose of removing any ambiguity regarding Jon Snow, luring her into a false sense of security, and stabbing her in a moment of intimacy. Had this happened in any less morally clear-cut context, you would not support this choice. But in this way, we know that Daenerys will not stand trial. She will not be executed in any way that would allow her dignity. We will never know her perspective. It will only be inferred from what Jon, Tyrion, and Varys think. All because the previous episodes reduced her to an object in the narrative, so that you do not resist when Jon stabs her, after which she dies without uttering a single word. An object, not a subject. The camera lingers on his pained face. Later, there are 0 consequences for either him or Tyrion, who took part in a conspiracy to kill her. One is allowed to ride off into the sunset, and another is granted a second most important governmental position in the new status quo. You may ask, what the hell does this have to do with fridging? Good question, because indeed, fridging has traditionally been defined as a woman being harmed to motivate a male protagonist. Daenerys is not a traditionally fridged woman. She is someone who we followed for 8 years, one of the protagonists, a leader in her own right, an abolitionist, a dragon rider, a military commander, a hero of the living who fought ice zombies on a dragon just 3 episodes prior. Yet by the final episode, she is reduced to a plot device with 0 insight into her internal thought process, and then quickly forgotten, with her death having little lasting repercussions, after which everyone involved moves on. This is the evolved fridging. Although Daenerys does not die in an inciting incident, her death and suffering become meaningful primarily through what they mean to the men around her. Her death is about what he feels. Her death is about his sadness. Her death is about his pain. Her death has no consequences whatsoever besides what it means for him. And he and everyone else quickly moves on while she is forgotten. We see him riding off with the free folk with an implication that his future continues after his hand finished hers. Exactly like in the classic fridging stories, except now it happens at the end. Daenerys stops being a subject before she dies, just like every fridged woman stops being a subject before she dies, if she was even a subject to begin with. And what I think is the most frustrating thing here is that She was a subject for years. Until she was not. I think Slavoj Zizek put it best. The finale combines the rejection of a radical change with an old anti-feminist motive at work in Wagner. For Wagner, there is nothing more disgusting than a woman who intervenes in political life driven by the desire for power. In contrast to male ambition, a woman wants power in order to promote her own narrow family interests, or even worse, her personal caprice, incapable as she is of perceiving the universal dimension of state politics. The same femininity which, within the close circle of family life, is the power of protective love, turns into obscene frenzy when displayed at the level of public and state affairs. Recall the lowest point in the dialogue of Game of Thrones when Daenerys tells Jon that, if he cannot love her as a queen, then fear should reign. The embarrassing vulgar motive of a sexually unsatisfied woman who explodes into a destructive fury. Daenerys as the Mad Queen is strictly a male fantasy, so the critics were right when they pointed out that her descent into madness was psychologically not justified. The view of Daenerys with Mad Fury's expression, flying on a dragon and burning houses and people, expresses patriarchal ideology with its fear of a strong political woman. Daenerys died because the writers could not imagine a reality in which she could have any different ending. Daenerys was not a wife, a mother, a girlfriend or a daughter, or at least not primarily. She was a political actor, not defined through patriarchal paradigms. She was a revolutionary active all throughout the story, one of those rare women who held power entirely in her own right, and the story could not imagine a future for someone like her. Hence, she found herself at the glass finish line. Transformation after transformation, all of the events that shaped her were undercut by questions. Will she return to Westeros? Will she get to rule it? If so, how will she rule it? Will she rebuild it? Will she break the wheel? Will she become a tyrant? Will she be a benevolent queen? Will she find the balance between fire and blood and diplomacy? The finale answers none of these questions. It does not imagine Daenerys ruling benevolently, tyrannically, struggling with day-to-day governance, breaking the wheel, falling to break the wheel, none of that. The only thing this narrative decision provides is interruption. These plot contrivances have the goal of not transforming her into a tyrant we could watch and enjoy, but reduced to a plot device. Daenerys stands just a few steps away from the Iron Throne, transformed by 8 years of her journey, but she never gets to inhabit the lessons she's learned. Of course, this analysis will inevitably be reduced to, "You're just mad, Daenerys didn't win." First of all, duh. Second of all, at some point during this dreadful season, Daenerys decides, let it be fear. Why won't you show us her ruling through fear then? Why don't we see her truly embody her tyranny? Why couldn't we spend numerous seasons having characters struggle against her and defeat her? The finale does not sit with any questions. Instead, it removes all of them. One swift stab takes her away before she can inhabit her final transformation. As such, Daenerys Targaryen found herself at the glass finish line. I would be amiss if I hadn't mentioned Missandei in the context of Game of Thrones, because her narrative treatment is a result of both misogyny and racism. Misogynoir. This makes it so that her death has additional ramifications, especially in a show as wide as Game of Thrones. Specifically, narrative media have a pattern of treating black women as even more disposable than their white counterparts. Black people, especially black women, are often seen as perennial supporting characters in white characters' arcs. For example, when a black character only exists to cheer on their white best friend, a trope in which a white character is spiritually guided by a black person, or the disposable black girlfriend, in which a black love interest is summarily replaced by a white or non-black love interest. The case of Missandei in this analysis is that it is actually very close to classical fridging, proving that this is not a trope of the foregone era. We meet Missandei in Season 3, where she is an enslaved translator to the sadistic slaver Krasnys Monoclos. Daenerys frees Missandei from slavery, after which she joins her entourage, becoming one of her advisors and her closest friend and confidant. Missandei develops a romantic relationship with Grey Worm, the commander of the eunuch army of the Unsullied. As slaves, Grey Worm and Missandei had their bodily autonomy stripped to serve a specific function. Grey Worm's body was mutilated for that purpose. Yet following their liberation, for the first time in their lives, they could rediscover their personhood and use their bodies for love. This is especially visible in a touching and tasteful scene in Season 7, where they explore intimacy for the first time. The highlight of touching and tasteful here is important, as sex scenes in Game of Thrones tend to be violent and gratuitous. Missandei and Grey Worm both managed to survive the existential threat of ice zombies. Sadly, they could not be spared from the writers and their subverting of expectations. Euron's forces conveniently managed to kidnap Missandei, a person that just so happens to be important to two important characters. Cersei puts her in chains and takes her to a parley so that she can be paraded in front of distraught Daenerys and Grey Worm. When Tyrion fails in convincing Cersei to free Missandei, she is beheaded as Daenerys and Grey Worm watch. Missandei was the last woman of color in the cast, and, as far as I'm concerned, the only black woman in it. She was a former slave who underwent a transformation into a liberated, politically active, and loved woman. She experienced genuine romantic attraction, survived the apocalypse, looked forward to the future, but that future was taken away from her. The writers had her transformation undone by reversing her back into a slave by putting her in chains and insisting that her only personal possession was her slave collar. They reduced her not to a political advisor to the most powerful woman in the world that found love, friendship, and happiness, but to her enslavement. And then she is violently murdered in front of her love interest and white best friend. Before Missandei could reach the return stage of her journey, her progress is reversed and her journey is cut short. Unlike Daenerys, whose death represents an evolved form of fridging, Missandei's death is very close to classical fridging. And like Daenerys, she found herself at the glass finish line. Yes, I know it's implied that Jinx survived, and it does not matter to me in the slightest, because unless I see at least a glimpse of her somewhere that isn't a zeppelin flying away with no blue hair anywhere, or a blink and you miss it frame, or unless one of the writers stops beating around the bush and says, yes, she survived, I will treat her as dead. Thank you very much. Jinx is arguably the most popular character in Arcane. Like Daenerys, she is introduced to us as a helpless girl, but unlike Daenerys, right at the beginning of the story, Jinx transforms into a villain. But even then, what always struck me about Jinx was that she was given the same integrity and sympathy that were usually the domains of male villains. Sad backstory, trauma, mental illness. Most importantly, Jinx was always depicted as sympathetic, and the narrative actively encouraged you to be empathetic towards her. Even more importantly, she was also never treated as someone that was beyond saving, something that's extremely rare for female villains and quite common for male ones. In one of my favorite pieces of writing that I revisit periodically, False Meadows says, I can't think of many overtly antagonistic female characters whose actions and motives are viewed as complex and therefore potentially redemptive, instead of just as proof that they're bad women. We think of men as anti-heroes, as capable of occupying an intense and fascinating moral grey area, of being able to fall and rise and fall again, but still be worthy of love on some fundamental level, because if it was the world and its failings that broke them, then we must surely owe them some sympathy. But we men aren't allowed to be broken by the world. Or if we are, it's the breaking that makes us villains. Wronged women turn into avenging furies, inhuman and monstrous. Once we cross to the dark side, we become adversaries to be defeated, not lost souls in need of mending. Which is what happens when you let benevolent sexism invest you in the idea that women are humanity's moral guardians and men its native renegades. Because if female goodness is only ever an inherent quality, something we're born both with and to be, then once lost, it must necessarily be lost forever, a severed limb we can't regrow. Whereas male goodness, by virtue of being an acquired quality, something bestowed through the kindness of women, earned through right action, or learned through struggle, can just as necessarily be gained and lost multiple times without being tarnished, like a jewel we might pain in hardship and later reclaim. Vi did not care about Jinx committing atrocities and murdering people, even if it happened right in front of her eyes. She believed Jinx to be worth saving on a fundamental level as a human being. However imperfect her methods were, it mattered that Vi remained resolute in this, even by the end of Season 1, sometimes against her better judgment, and that the story itself is never conclusively set on Jinx being completely evil and irredeemable. Sure, Vi briefly changed her mind in Season 2, but some part of her never gave up, even if Jinx considered herself beyond saving. As she walked away from Vi after imprisoning her in her own cell, she claimed that she will now break the cycle, which involved her trying to commit suicide under the assumption that her death will fix the misery she brings to her close ones. Only time travel saves her. Jinx then participates in the final battle where she saves those same people whose systemic oppression destroyed her life and created the very cycle she thought she must end by killing herself. By the end of the fight, she and Vi struggle against Warwick, a monster made out of the body of their adoptive father, and eventually chooses to let go of Vi and plunge into the abyss. Writer Christian Link has said that Season 2 Jinx deals with the question of who she is and who she wants to be when no one tells her what she is supposed to be. And indeed, we see her take on new roles in this season. The disregard towards the political storyline of the show in favor of an Avengers Unite moment between Piltover and Zone probably hurt Jinx the most, as Season 2 set up a direct challenge to her core belief that her destiny is only to destroy and that she could never cause anything good. Sevika recognizes this first. Jinx has the chance to unite Zone in a way that Silco was never able to. In fact, the showrunners themselves hinted at the fact that this may be the source of conflict between Jinx and Vi in Season 2. For Vi, I think, suddenly feeling like an outsider in the Undercity, and seeing also the Undercity start to think of Jinx as the true Zoneite, and the person that stands up to the aggression of the Topsiders, is a difficult thing for Vi to deal with. So I think there's a bit of these two identities that they have for each other, and also for themselves, that suddenly Vi is really kind of no longer at home in the Undercity. But did Jinx ever find an answer to these questions? I would say she explored them, but never truly found an answer. Her decision to aid Piltover in the final fight comes after a time off screen, and we don't know what she was thinking during this time, and before the story can resume her meditations on these questions, she is dead. In the monomyth-like structure, Jinx would be allowed to either overcome these beliefs, or alternatively, become even worse and have her arc reach a wholly different conclusion. But neither of this happens. She is stopped halfway between these 2 points. Even if she continues her journey of self-discovery elsewhere, we will not see it. She will not be like Frodo, who sails west after having been transformed by his adventure. Rather, her transformation is abruptly stopped halfway, and it's only vaguely implied that she will possibly integrate lessons learned somewhere far away from Zone and Piltover. What matters in the case of Jinx is that, even though the usual trope of female villainy was subverted, and unlike other female villains, she was not treated as if she were fundamentally incapable of redemption, it can be reversed back into common tropes. And I would be amiss if I hadn't mentioned that even the part of her self-discovery and maturing comes from her taking care of a child, which reveals a lack of imagination from the writers that we keep running into. Her maturity doesn't come from becoming a political leader, reuniting with Vi in some context, or literally anything else. It comes from a child and then from death. Her whole story is about turning from this little bumbling sister into someone who is able to take responsibility and do what a big sister needs to do. Isha is really that example for Jinx. She is starting to understand what it's like to be responsible and to be able to grow. Jinx was not so much allowed redemption and healing, as she was simply removed from the narrative before she could even seriously ponder the possibility of it. Her continuity is abruptly stopped. If she manages to heal somewhere, she will do so alone and off-screen. But easily the worst thing is that Jinx's death confirms everything she believed about herself, that those she loves are better off without her. Jinx had a very real suicide attempt, but make no mistake, choosing to fall with Warwick is also a suicidal gesture. And according to the writer Christian Link, Vi is incapable of sacrificing the ones she loves and leaving them behind. Jinx has a moment where she has grown and she's capable of stepping in, and it's a big decision that's important for her. So in essence, what he means is, maturity is making your loved ones think you killed yourself for them, and then leaving them, never coming back, and healing alone. Although this case is much different from Daenerys, and what happens to Jinx is a far cry from the medieval-level misogyny of Game of Thrones, the pattern of the writers being unable to conceive of Jinx as having a future is the same as with Daenerys. Jinx and Daenerys both belong to the new category of disposable women. Not those who die at the beginning to set the story in motion, but those who die right at the very end, before they are capable of fully inhabiting their transformed selves. Eleven's death was probably the most controversial aspect of the already controversial final season of Stranger Things. Like Jinx, Eleven was the face of her show. She was born to a woman that was experimented on in a special program, which affected her in the womb, giving her psychokinetic powers. Immediately upon her birth, she was renamed from Jane to 11, her personhood reduced into a number. She was tested and experimented on, not knowing anything of the outside world, until her escape at the age 11. Only then does 11 start experiencing things that should have been normal for her. Having friends, falling in love, going on adventures, making decisions, finding a family, and maturing. In the last season of the show, 11's goal is to defeat the main antagonist of the story, Vecna. When she tells her adoptive father that this means she must die to end the cycle, he resists. Life has been so unfair to you, so cruel, but you never let it break you. I need you to fight, kid. When she psychically visits her boyfriend shortly before her death, she restates the same thing she said to her father. None of this will ever end if I'm still here. And although the show left hints that 11 might have survived, and simply left somewhere where she could live in peace, like Jinx, she is as good as dead from a purely pragmatic point of view. One of the Duffer brothers had so justified this choice. There was never a version of the story where 11 was hanging out with the gang in the end. For us and our writers, we didn't want to take her powers away. She represents magic in a lot of ways, and the magic of childhood. For our characters to move on, and for the story of Hawkins and the Upside Down to come to a close, 11 had to go away. I can't help but see many parallels with Jinx. Both she and 11 went through a lot of suffering, both of them chose death at some point as a way to break the cycle neither of them started, chose to participate in, or benefited from, and both of them were removed from the narrative by the very end. In both instances, their ultimate sacrifice for the sake of other people is framed as a sign of maturity. In another segment of this interview, Ross said, "With 11's speech to Hopper, he's been a great father figure, but he's been very overprotective because he's lost a daughter before, and he's so fearful of that. As a result, he's not allowing her to make her own decisions or to really grow into an adult." Throughout the show, we saw 11 experience a normal life that she was deprived of for the first 11 years of her existence, only to kill her off by the end of her story, and thus deny her the possibility to integrate the lessons she learned that would let her to truly become a mature adult. In fact, 11 is not even allowed adulthood. She dies at age 16. Indeed, it is a mature decision to sacrifice herself for other people, but maturity does not matter when we run into the same exact problem. 11 does not reach the return stage of her journey. She accumulated lessons and experiences all throughout her journey. These transformed her into a new self, but she does not get the chance to cherish them or inhabit them. In Campbell's terms, she does not become the mistress of the two worlds, and does not experience the freedom to live, while most of her peers do, thanks to her ultimate sacrifice. When asked about 11's death in the Joshua Horowitz interview, one of the brothers said, "And as far as 11 and the character of 11, the initial conversation that we were having is, from a realistic standpoint, how does she continue to exist in the world? And the characters were having that debate throughout the season. What could that look like? Is there a happy ending? Is a happy ending possible? Like a full happy ending, where she's married to Mike and they're living a perfectly happy life, and the government has completely laid off them, and they've ended their lab and their experiment, and we just couldn't figure out a way for that to work." The Duffer brothers articulate exactly what I've been talking about here. Writers have problems imagining futures for women, and when they do, that future has a very narrow scope. Their version of a perfect future for 11 was being married to Mike, not going to college, not finding a job she likes, not continuing to find herself and come into herself, not staying with her chosen family. It was either marriage or death. And because they disqualified the possibility of her and Mike marrying, the option was not a breakup, 11 moving away, 11 staying around but the two of them remaining friends, 11 joining a circus, 11 becoming a NASA engineer and flying to space, 11 nuking the government, or 11 just being a normal person. She has to die because apparently her significance in the story was to be a figure akin to E.T. The status of a protagonist or a face of the show does not protect female characters against the inability of the writers to imagine them having a future. Often, the only future they imagine for them is a very narrow scope of wife and mother. Never single, never childless, never just healing and growing, never just existing as a person. And if marriage is out of the picture, the only alternative is a coffin. In the 100, the titular 100 teenagers that grew on a space station are thrown onto the Earth to see if it can be inhabited by them. Lexa was not one of them. She has been living on Earth her entire life as a founder and leader of several united groups, known as the Coalition. At some point, Lexa and Clark, the leader of the group sent on Earth, negotiate an alliance, begin cooperating, and eventually fall in love. The two women consummate their relationship, but shortly afterwards, Lexa gets shot in the stomach and dies. I was not watching the show as it was airing, but I remember the reactions to Lexa's death. It was everywhere. To see the scale and discourse around it at the time, you can still find articles from Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, IndieWire, Yahoo, and others that describe the aftermath in detail. Eventually, the writers of the show had to apologize for it. Fans have been getting mad about characters dying already by the time of the 19th century, when they begged Doyle to resurrect Sherlock Holmes after what was supposed to be the last story featuring him. Sometimes backlash to deaths of popular characters is disproportional, and it results from them becoming too attached. Other times, it's perfectly proportional, and they make valid points. Lexa's death is firmly in the second category. Almost a decade after it happened, Anna Govert reflected on the situation. Across her various appearances in seasons 2 and 3, Lexa became the kind of lightning-in-a-bottle character that inspires a cult ferocity, the type of character that people grow attached to, and entire fandom cultures spring up around. And at the time, that was mainly due to her outlier status as a genuinely complex and engaging lesbian character. She was allowed to have a tortured past, her lover was killed at the hands of Brenda Strong's Ice Queen, a feud that could have carried the series for seasons on end if properly handled, while also remaining strong, depicted as soft and sweet, while still being smart and brutal. With Clark, Lexa let her walls down and became the picture of a shy, awkward romantic type, willing to give peace a chance because she believed in the musings of this girl who fell from the stars. As a leader, she encompassed all the brutal teachings of the grander culture, while ultimately pushing for change for the betterment of both her people and these new outsiders. She was cunning, she was kind, she was a badass, and she was gay. The complete package for a viewership starved of complex or meaningful characters for years on end. And the relationship between Clark and Lexa was just as important, as Clark's status as the network's first bisexual lead elevated their blossoming love story that was so beautifully colored by both respect and betrayal. Their romance continues to develop until, eventually, they consummate their relationship in Season 3's 7th episode. But, of course, good things just can't last for lesbians on television, and merely a few minutes later, Lexa is shot and killed by her advisor Titus. As you can imagine, taking out one of TV's coolest lesbian characters not in a grand battle, but instead at the whim of a stray bullet, hi, Tara from Buffy, at the hands of her father figure, who was actually aiming at her aforementioned lover, did not exactly go over well. The heart-wrenching sequence checks almost every box that separates a problematic slaying of a queer character from the kind of death typical of these survivalist shows. Lexa's father figure killed her in an attempt to murder her female lover, firmly establishing that her death was a direct result of her queerness, and she died immediately after finally attaining true romantic happiness, a trope that has plagued lesbian characters on television for decades. Even in the context of the series' penchant for violence and major character death, Lexa's passing feels particularly cruel, ultimately sending a dismal message that the only end for a leader attempting to make change within a violent culture is, in fact, a violent one. Lexa opened her heart to love and compassion, both for Clark and for the betterment of her people's lives, and she paid the ultimate price for it. By now, you know the gist of my argument. Female characters die before they can fully embody the transformation they underwent. But Lexa's arc does not so much end prematurely, as it is somewhere in the midpoint, with her about to make one more leap into new trials and tribulations. As such, a great deal of her narrative possibility was cut short. I was not aware of this until I was writing the video, but I was reading fan discussions about the 100 to know what fans were thinking about this decision, and found this post on Reddit, published already a couple of years after Lexa died. Question to those angry about Lexa's ending. So, I am sure you already know, Alicia Debman-Carey left the 100 to do Fear the Walking Dead. My question is, what would you have had them do with Lexa other than kill her that would actually make sense, because I literally can't think of nothing. She was the commander. She couldn't have just disappeared. If anyone has any ideas, I would like to hear them. Otherwise, stop complaining. The actress left by choice, and they had to do something with her character. Also, it's a post-apocalyptic show. Not everyone is gonna live. And from what I could gather, it's indeed true that the actress planned to leave the production. But what I want to point out your attention to is this. What would you have had them do with Lexa, other than kill her? That would actually make sense, because I literally can't think of nothing. I could not have asked for a better illustration of the point I've been hammering home here. I believe that the writers of the 100 had exactly the same thought process as this Redditor. They had an obstacle in the form of an actress wishing to perform in another TV show, had to write around it, so of course their conclusion was, therefore, unceremoniously kill her off. Why not just recast her though? Obviously the actress was very popular, but it's not like recasts have been unprecedented. Some were done well, some weren't, but it was a possibility to ponder. Whether you like the idea of a recast or not, it's still pretty telling that this idea seemingly hadn't come to anyone's mind. It was, Alicia is leaving? Stray bullet, that is. And if you're dead set on not recasting, the second possibility is in the comment of that very thread. I don't think anyone's angry that she died. It's just the way how she died. She was the strongest character on the show, and they had killed her the stupidest way possible. And that's exactly it. Of course people would still be mad about Lexa's death if that happened, but I don't think the backlash will be as severe. As long as Lexa's death came after her arc was complete in some way, however brief it might have been, it would have been a bit easier to stomach it. If she died on her own terms, in a way that's consistent with her character, such as in battle protecting her people, viewers would probably hate this death less. But Lexa dies suddenly in a wholly reactive death that says very little about her as a person, what lessons she's learned, and how she integrated them. This analysis would be incomplete if I hadn't continued with the thread raised by Govert. Lexa's death was an example of the trope known as bury your gays. The presentation of deaths of LGBT characters, where these characters are nominally able to be viewed as more expendable than their heterosexual counterparts. In this way, the death is treated as exceptional in its circumstances. In aggregate, queer characters are more likely to die than straight characters. Indeed, it may be because they seem to have less purpose compared to straight characters, or that the supposed natural conclusion of their story is an early death. The reasons for this trope have evolved somewhat over the years. For a good while, it was because the depraved homosexual trope and its ilk pretty much limited portrayals of explicitly gay characters to villainous characters, or at least characters who weren't given much respect by the narrative. This was due to negative attitudes towards gay people and due to the Moral Guardian's Highs Code, which did not allow gay people to be shown on screen unless it was part of a plotline that showed that they were wicked. This meant that most of them would either die or be punished by the end. Even somewhat sympathetic characters would usually receive punishment, as their sexuality was perceived as a negative trait. Contrary to what some angry commenter who is somehow still watching this video may say, this does not mean that nobody is allowed to kill gay characters. Just like the thesis of this video is not actually, I think female characters should never be killed off. But I do think that Lexa's death is a particularly insidious instance of the dead lesbian syndrome, as it has clear lesbophobic undertones that would have been absent if, say, she died in battle. The guy who kills her believes that the love between Clark and Lexa is wrong on religious grounds. And apparently, she's not even the first lesbian character to die from a stray bullet. The show came out in 2016, long after the Hays Codes had been repealed. But as we can see, residues of it remained. In fact, Govert talks about the backlash to this death in those terms as well. After Lexa was killed, the internet exploded. Queer audiences across the globe came together to voice their displeasure at the loss of this character and the problematic nature of the storyline itself. And while Lexa was not the first lesbian character to die on screen that year, 27 LGBTQ+ characters were killed off in 2016 across various networks and shows, the combination of multiple senseless deaths and her status as a truly unique lesbian character created the perfect storm that would eventually brew into a revolution. The backlash was so intense that showrunner Jason Rothenberg wrote an open letter to fans apologizing for the storyline, but the wheels had already begun to spin towards tangible change. Many television creatives pledged to be more considerate when killing off queer characters, and the CW eventually went on to become the top broadcast network for LGBTQ+ representation for multiple years in a row, according to GLAAD's yearly reports. Lexa's death ushered in a new era for lesbian representation specifically, slowing television deaths and creating an elevated awareness for how lesbians have historically been portrayed on screen. We also need to put Lexa's death in context. One thing that interested me was this part about 27 LGBT+ characters being killed off in popular franchises in 2016 alone. I looked at the source, and indeed, it was 27. And of those, 19 were sapphic women, including Lexa, and one was a transgender woman. And I had not examined every single one of these characters and the context in which they die, but I'm willing to bet good money that at least a significant portion of them were on the glass finish line. And my solution to scheduling conflict is still recast. I seriously think more show writers should consider this as a possibility, because recasting still preserves the possibility of characters having futures that aren't abruptly cut off because the actor has different career choices. And I don't know about you guys, but I will always take the possibility ahead of a certain end. Much of Rue Bennett's story in HBO's Euphoria had her struggle with drug addiction, fueled by her mental health problems. After a series of pitfalls and relapses, Season 2 has Rue resolute in her desire to stay clean. But Rue's addiction followed her years after finishing high school, in the form of debts, which forced her to become a drug mule and then an informant for the DEA. In spite of spending a substantial portion of her screen time in Season 3 in the presence of the very same opiates she was addicted to, she nevertheless remained clean until she was given a fentanyl-laced perk as revenge for her collaboration with the DEA. Rue dies after consuming it. One thing I will absolutely acknowledge is that showrunner Sam Levinson hinted that he decided to write Rue's death for a reason unrelated to the glass finish line, the fatal overdose of Angus Cloud, who played Fesco on Euphoria. This was a way for Levinson to process his grief over this passing. Nevertheless, intentions do not matter as much as the impact, and regardless of what he intended, he wrote Rue's death in exactly the way that is indicative of the glass finish line, even though there were other possibilities. In an interview with Gold Derby, he was asked about Rue's death and said, "I also don't make the show for the fans, in the sense that, I'm going to give them what they want and expect. I make the show for an audience, and an audience who's willing to sit with uncomfortable truths. Painful ones even. Look, I think that the wish that Rue was able to tie up all the loose ends in her life and have an emotional catharsis with each character in her life before death is not the reality of addiction or overdoses. Things are unfinished. Things are left unsaid." So, in essence, Levinson follows the same logic that supporters of this decision follow. Rue dying of a fentanyl overdose because it's realistic. After all, it's true that drug addicts die of overdoses all the time, and there is a fentanyl crisis in the United States. Those who have any criticism of this narrative choice are obviously too silly to know that this is realistic and that drug addicts die. And as we know, Euphoria is a very realistic show to begin with, and shows the exact realities of an average high school where everyone dresses like this, everyone does drugs, teachers let students make plays mocking each other without intervening, and let people fight on stage. And it's also very realistic for the same group of friends to end up entangled with a drug cartel, with one of them having his toe chopped off, and then being buried alive with a snake, and another being a drug mule. And it's also completely realistic for most of the female characters to be entangled in the sex trade, one as a strip club manager, one as a pimp, one as a sugar baby, and one as an OnlyFans creator. That's realistic. For the record, nothing about fiction necessarily has to be realistic, otherwise science fiction and fantasy would not be popular genres. Slice of life does not have to be realistic either. Euphoria worked even when it was an exaggeration of the life of teenagers. Skins worked for the very same reason, and people still enjoyed both because the characters and themes carried them. In short, while realistic writing can be compelling, it does not inherently equal compelling. Indeed, in theory, Rue's death is realistic because in real life, drug addicts are not characters with arcs and roles to play that convey certain themes. But Rue is not actually a person. She is not a real drug addict. She is a character whose arc is supposed to communicate something to the audience. In this instance, her death does not communicate anything of substance, as most people know drug addicts die to be true. It does not even have the thematic weight that the deaths of addicts should have. What kind of a broader narrative or thematic purpose does it serve to have a character successfully fight her drug addiction, remain clean for the entire season, in spite of being in the presence of drugs for its entire rundown, and then die when she takes a perk she does not know is laced with fentanyl. She does not relapse and die because of the choices she's made. The death is not a consequence of her addiction, but a punishment for something she already overcame. What this communicates isn't really addicts relapse and die, it's someone can give you a fentanyl-laced perk and you can die. Had Levinson written a situation in which her role as a drug mule makes her relapse and her death was a direct consequence of her own choices, I would find it much easier to stomach, as it would communicate what he tried to convey in a much more resonant way. What strikes me is that Rue became religious. While it is not really portrayed as strictly positive, it doesn't have to be. She can enter religious psychosis. She can relapse trying to induce a state in which she can talk to God. She can use her faith as strength to stay clean. She can become a nun. There are so many futures I can imagine for Rue that could involve her inhabiting her transformation, becoming the mistress of the two worlds, with the freedom to live, that aren't necessarily positive developments, and which may eventually result in her death. If Levinson was dead set on killing off Rue, then sure, kill her off, but not without her inhabiting this new transformation. Write a storyline in which she wants more relapses and does not make it out this time, but make that transformation matter, because in this season, Rue does not transform. She is shuffled around across the border and then dies because someone gave her a pill. And now, my good faith towards Sam Levinson is over. I don't think Rue should have died, even if writing this helped him process Angus's death. I would like to briefly return to Gail Simone because Rue actually follows a pattern she noticed. If a male character is harmed, injured, or otherwise suffers from a certain affliction, he is often allowed to heal from it and come back stronger than ever. When women have certain afflictions, in this case drug addiction, that affliction is forever. She will never heal from it. It will inevitably be her downfall, and there is no possibility for her to have a future. Her fate is sealed. And I actually started thinking, does Rue have this in common with any other female characters? Is it still common for addicted women in fiction to never recover and die? Of course, I don't have the resources to conduct an empirical study, but I can discuss situations where this indeed happened. Natalie from Yellowjackets also dies from an accidental fentanyl overdose. Jane from Breaking Bad dies due to choking on her own vomit while relapsing on heroin, while Jesse survives. Sarah Lynn from BoJack Horseman overdoses on heroin and dies, while BoJack, who's addicted to alcohol and pills, lives. More importantly, Jesse's and BoJack's addiction was not a death sentence. Jane's and Sarah Lynn's was. Let's look at another popular addict, Kendall Roy. Drug addiction was one of the more important elements of his arc, but Kendall did not die from it, nor was he reduced to his affliction. His storyline tackled many different things and wasn't reduced to will he stay clean or not. Even when relapsing, he did not die. Sure, just a couple of examples. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe some confirmation bias slipping in, but it does not change the fact that Rue, Sarah Lynn, and Jane follow the pattern named by Simone. Also worth noting here is the difference to the levels of backlash Rue's death caused, as opposed to Lexa. Lexa's death was described as bury your gays in no uncertain terms, and met with heavy backlash. Rue, who is also a lesbian, and a lesbian of color at that, is rarely if ever described in such terms. I believe that if it was 10 years ago, people would be more skeptical and openly critical of this death, which speaks to a certain societal regression. Regardless of Rue's sexuality and race, she fits right in with other women in this group. She was not allowed to inhabit her transformation as newly clean or retransform back into an active addict. One pill reverses her entire trajectory. Her journey is suddenly interrupted before the return. I will leave this section with an interview that Zendaya gave in 2022. Zendaya also told Entertainment Weekly that knowing how much Rue means to people who've experienced addiction and loss is why she has hope for the way the character's arc will develop. We can't leave her here, she said. It's really important that there's light at the end of the tunnel for her, because I think she has a lot of beauty inside her. Whether or not she quite sees that yet is her own thing. The light at the end of the tunnel can shine for Rue all it wants. She will not reach it if she walks into an invisible barrier. I intentionally left the creme de la creme of this analysis for the very end. Yellowjackets proves that the phenomenon I'm describing is applicable even in the cast that's majority women. Some of the deaths in this show do not fit into the framework I described, while others do. As such, they each serve as a great case study and a comparison point. Basically, I have accidentally discovered a control group. And I actually will not start with the obvious contender, but with Laura Lee, whose fate is an example of a death scene that does not come prematurely, but actually concludes her arc. Laura Lee, a deeply religious girl, seeks a way to make it out of the wilderness, and it seems like the Lord has given her a sign. The girls find an abandoned small plane and a manual on how to operate it. Laura Lee is resolute in learning how to operate it and using it to get help for the rest of the group. And she does take the flight, and it does seem like everything will go well, but then the plane catches on fire and explodes. Laura Lee's death works on 2 levels. It establishes the stakes. Even if you survive the initial crash, you may not return home, and not for obvious reasons, such as survival in the wilderness. More importantly, this death comes as the logical conclusion of her arc. She tries, she fails, she dies, but it's complete. It would be an entirely different story if Laura Lee was diligently studying the plane manual, but was suddenly killed by a bear on her way to the plane. That would be cutting her storyline short right before the finish line, because it would prevent her from integrating the lessons she's learned over the course of her stay in the wilderness. In this instance, flying the plane. I think this works really well as an illustration for what exactly I mean when I say that the women I discuss have in common the fact that their goals are not just not reached in a meaningful sense. They undertake the journey, they are closer or further to the finish line depending on the case, but then boom, they walk into the glass finish line that prevents them from applying and integrating lessons learned. Laura Lee worked for her goal. She reached her goal. She tried to complete it using the lessons she's learned, but failed in its execution. This is what makes her different from other examples I discussed. The second case is Jackie Taylor, of course, about whom we know that she won't make it out of the wilderness relatively early. The question is only her precise fate, and the show delivers in the best way possible. Jackie Taylor starts out as a leader of the team, but she is also the most unprepared for the reality of the wilderness. While Jackie excels in the social life of high school, a survival scenario has her skills undervalued, and she feels more and more isolated in the group. What doesn't help are the tensions between her and her best friend Shauna, who hides from her that she's pregnant with her boyfriend's child. But the truth eventually comes out. Jackie insists that Shauna should leave the cabin for this transgression, but Shauna returns that Jackie should do it instead. The other girls agree, and Jackie has no choice but to concede to this ostracization. That night, a sudden cold snap kills Jackie. This, like Laura Lee's death, raises the stakes. Not strictly because winter is coming for them, but also because disunity of this sort may have disastrous consequences and makes all the Yellowjackets complicit in the death of someone important to them. Moreover, the show remains interested in Jackie. She frequently appears as a hallucination, and the stakes are further raised when Jackie's death contributes to the group passing the moral threshold of cannibalism in what is one of the most iconic scenes of the show. Even 25 years after her death, Jackie's spirit still lingers, depending on your interpretation, either as Shauna's hallucinations representing her guilt or as a supernatural intervention. So, was Jackie fridged or disposed of for Shauna or other Yellowjackets solely to motivate them? I would say no. For one, Jackie is not an empty vessel for someone else's sadness and grief, and while her arc is tragic, it is complete. She is not forgotten by the narrative the way other fridged women often are, and much like the death of Laura Lee, it ended up increasing the stakes of the show, which is exactly what a good death scene should do. Laura Lee's death communicated that the predicament of the group is so unpredictable that you may die in a plane accident after surviving the first one. Jackie's death had the group reach the moral fault line and engage in enthusiastic cannibalism. Even if you argue that Jackie or Laura Lee were fridged and count as disposable women, then it actually supports my thesis. It just loses this comparative dimension. Other deaths in Yellowjackets definitely fit my glass finish line framework much better. For starters, I'm aware that Natalie's death by the end of season 2 probably had a pragmatic dimension. It's hard to find a definitive source, but speculation says that Juliette Lewis, who plays adult Naath, wanted out of the show after season 2 since she did not enjoy her storyline. Other sources claim that Juliet always signed up only for 2 seasons, or that her decision was dictated by her preference to star in movies as opposed to TV shows. Whatever the case, what makes the death of Natalie and Lexa similar was that there was not an attempt for a recast. Of course, I do not know about the particulars of TV show's production, as I'm constantly reminded by House of the Dragon fans, so maybe a recast was truly not possible. But regardless of this, Naath's death was very similar to Lexa's death in that it was so convoluted and incidental that it ended up being bizarre. Misty just so happens to have a fentanyl injection, Lisa just so happens to make it onto the scene, Misty just so happens to attack her, and Natalie just so happens to jump in front of her to take the injection for herself. A truly puzzling sequence of events. On one hand, it does fit Naath's self-sacrificial nature and her always serving as a moral spine of the group. On the other hand, it does not change the fact that it's so sudden, and it does not tell us much about Naath's character beyond what we already knew. Much like Rue, Naath struggled with drug addiction during her arc. Unlike Rue, Natalie didn't relapse. She just jumped in front of Misty's fatal injection. As such, we will never know if Natalie will heal, grow, relapse, go crazy, start a kebab stand, run for president. All the possibilities are cut short for her, including the ones that see her further degrade. And here, let me rant for a bit. People have increasingly started using the "it's tragic" or "it's a tragedy" excuse to defend stupid narrative choices. Tragic is not a synonym for sad. Not every sudden, sad, or gut-wrenching death is tragic. Tragedy has a structure. Naath's death is not due to her flaws, but because of narrative contrivance, written because the actress wanted out, and they would not recast her or find another way to write her out of the story. Or plainly, give her a death scene that would not be insulting. In short, Naath's arc is not a culmination, but a story cut short. And I would be willing to let it slide, even though I would still think it's bullshit, if it wasn't for the fact that the same exact pattern repeated itself not once, but twice more. In the wilderness, Lottie becomes the spiritual leader of whether she really has psychic powers or if it's a result of her deprivation from antipsychotic meds is left up to interpretation. Adult Lottie runs a cult, an intentional community, where Naath ends up against her will, and where the surviving Yellowjackets unite for one last hunt. This results in Natalie's death, though not in a hand, but in a fentanyl injection of doom. Then, in season 3, Lottie's compound is dissolved off-screen, she becomes further convinced of her psychic power, and starts getting close to Shauna's daughter Callie, believing her to be spiritually relevant. And then Lottie is found dead at the bottom of the stairs, and we later find out that it was Callie who pushed her down. What helps my case is that Simone Kessel, who plays adult Lottie, expressed disappointment for the ultimate fate of her character. Kessel says that after that season 2 finale, when Lottie is carted off to the psychiatric hospital, she had hopes for her character. She envisioned Lottie channeling a little bit of Randall Patrick Murphy, played by Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest this season. That's a dream for actors, Kessel says, and I would have shaved my head. But that was not meant to be. After the labor strikes ended in November 2023, Kessel got a call that Lottie would be coming back to Yellowjackets, but for only 4 episodes. Her dream of exploring Lottie in a psych ward was just that, since the creative team had other plans for how the character's present-day storyline would play out. I was pretty broken-hearted because it felt like it had come to an end just when I felt Lottie was coming into her own. I was excited that season 3 would take her somewhere interesting, and unfortunately, they just decided that storyline was no longer. I don't know what happened in the writer's room, or whether they decided that they wanted to bring in a fresh character, or just have the 3 main girls. I don't know. I think that's a question for Jonathan, Ashley, and Bart. As an actor, you always think, was it something I did? Was it my performance? Could I have done it differently? I just felt it was premature because I wanted to see, and I know that the fans and the supporters of the show did too, where Lottie was going. So to have that just cut off didn't feel good. Notice that Simone and I named the same problem. Lottie's potential future that had a clear groundwork was cut short before it could be explored. We do not see her become even more delusional, we do not see her use Kali, we do not see her further poison the minds of fellow Yellowjackets. She's just pushed down the stairs and dies. And interestingly enough, although other characters who died in adulthood were given the Inside the Plane montage, Lottie did not. I guess that is only for white people. Lauren Ambrose, who plays adult Van, also expressed mixed feelings about her character's fate. Ambrose and Cypress were both surprised by this narrative choice. Van is the ultimate survivor. Her mother had an abusive nature. Then she gets almost blown up by the plane, and then she's almost killed when she's attacked by wolves. And then she's got this cancer that then goes into remission, Ambrose says. I assumed it would be the cancer that did her in. This ultimate survivor who is unable to survive this very real and human thing. Then it wasn't that, and reading it was really shocking. All of a sudden, Hilary Swank is murdering me. I'm like, okay, we're going to make it work. As Catherine Hahn said to me once, champions adjust. My favorite parts of the show were seeing how the trauma of the past plays on them in their modern lives, and I think Juliet's leaving opened the door to anything can happen and anyone can die at any time, she says. Hopefully they get back to the original thesis of, okay, how do these traumas play out? Because it expanded very quickly. For the record, Kessel expressed similar thoughts earlier this season while discussing Lottie's death with Variety. Ambrose too wishes the show could have explored the Thaisa-Van dynamic a bit more in the end. And Van as an individual, Cypress adds. I think that Lauren brings up a very good point. Yellowjackets stopped exploring the effects of trauma on these women and instead opted for them killing each other. Which, sure, this is an exploration of that trauma, but it takes a very one-dimensional direction. Moreover, Van's trauma was never truly explored, even though she goes through so much over the course of the story. She is left behind by Jackie and Shauna immediately after the crash, she is mauled by wolves, she is almost set on fire, and she still makes it out of the wilderness, only to get cancer. But the show never really explores how these experiences shaped her in adulthood. She is reintroduced relatively late into the game, and her story is mostly framed through the lens of her relationship with Thaisa, which leaves both women underexplored as individuals. Before we could explore Van as her own character, she is killed by a character that had very little presence before and was only made relevant because they managed to get Hilary Swank to play her adult version, which may explain why they are firing people left and right. Yet another thing I find to be severely lacking in the discourse surrounding it is that it is also bury your gays. Sure, I did see resistance from queer fans, but way too often these narrative developments got hand-waved in a way that's similar to Rue's death. Do you think that the show about girl cannibals will have a sunshine and rainbows ending? It makes sense! Given my previous interactions with Yellowjackets fans, I know that this is the response I will also get now, which is a strawman of my actual argument that I will not entertain. I already outlined the differences between the deaths of Flora Lee and Jackie, and Lottie, Van and Naath. It's up to you whether you're willing to engage with them. The woman dies. She dies to provide a plot twist. She dies to develop the narrative. She dies for cathartic effect. She dies because no one could think of what else to do with her. Dies because there weren't any better story ideas around. Dies because her death was the very best idea that anyone could come up with. And so the woman dies. The woman dies so the man can be sad about it. The woman dies so the man can suffer. She dies to give him a destiny. Dies so he can fall to the dark side. Dies so he can lament her death. As he stands there, brimming with grief, brimming with life, the woman lies there in silence. The woman dies for him. We watch it happen. We read about it happening. We come to know it well. The woman gets married. She gets married to move the story to the next stage. She gets married so that things can wind down to a nice finish. Not sure how to end it? Never fear. A wedding scene will always do the trick. Everyone loves a good wedding. There's really no better ending. And so the woman gets married. She gets married because they never really figured out how to develop her character. She gets married because she is no longer needed. She gets married because they couldn't be bothered to write a separate plotline for her anymore. And come on, what's so bad about that? She's married, for Christ's sake. She must be happy. The woman gets pregnant. She gets pregnant to give them material for more drama. She gets pregnant so as to produce another character. When things are getting a bit stuck plot-wise, she gets pregnant to move the action forward. She gets pregnant to draw the story out. The woman is raped. She is raped so that the man can be angry about it. She is raped to spark his vengeful spirit. She is raped so that the man can look to the sky and howl in agony. She is raped so the man can have a car chase. Raped to bring about real action. Raped so the bad guy can be slowly but surely hunted down. Raped to put the man in the mood to blow up the enemy's hideout. Raped to make him feel like annihilating the enemy. The woman dies. She dies to make a good story. The woman is raped. She is raped to make a good story. We grow up watching it happen. We start not thinking anything of it, not feeling anything about it. Or maybe we were never that affected by it. Who knows? Regardless of whether a character is a classically first woman, a traditional disposable woman, a woman on the glass finish line whose heroine journey was suddenly interrupted, or a combination of all of those, the point they have in common is that the completion of their journeys are disproportionately often cut short before they can inhabit their roles as mistresses of the two worlds, wielding the freedom to live. For a classically fridged or disposable woman, she never gets to go on any quest. Her death incites the quest of others. For the glass finish line, the heroine goes through quests, trials, and triabulations, and often conquers them, but doesn't get to inhabit her new transformed self, doesn't get to cherish her transformation, and sometimes doesn't even get to fully complete it. A third of her journey is denied to her. A glass gap, if you will. The problem is not and has never been that female characters die, or if they die more often than men or less often than men. It is simply that there is a specific pattern in which writers rob women of their futures and the completion of their journeys. The dead wife is denied the future. The first woman is denied the future. The powerful political actor is denied the future. The deeply loved black woman is denied the future. A villainous woman considering other options is denied the future. A girl who was given a chance at exploring normal life is denied the future. A lesbian warrior is denied the future. A drug-addicted woman is denied the future. And another one, and the one with religious psychosis, and the one who survived a plane crash, being mauled by wolves, getting set on fire, and cancer. Men also die, but are more likely to come back. When they're injured, they are more likely to recover. When they have a disorder or a disease, they are more likely to heal from it, or, at the very least, they are not defined by it. When they're evil, they are more likely to get redemption arcs and second chances. And even if they aren't, they are more likely to be allowed to exist as complicated individuals. And even when male characters die, they are more likely to do so after their journeys are complete, after they're allowed to inhabit their transformed selves. Women are human beings. A shocking statement, I know, and should be able to experience the full scope of the human experience. Women reading fiction should also be able to see women experience the full scope of that experience. But still, in the year of our Lord, 2026, they are rarely allowed to experience the same things as men. Their men are rarely, if ever, stuffed into the fridge. They rarely, if ever, get to be resurrected after their deaths. They are rarely, if ever, treated as worthy of healing and redemption. Their journeys are disproportionately often cut short, just before they reach the finish line. And if they are allowed to reach that finish line, they will usually end up heterosexually married and or with babies on the way. Female characters are more likely to die for shock value, for their deaths to only serve as motivation for others, usually men, for their deaths to not have as much significance in the grand scheme of things, for their suffering to be disproportionate, for them to not be allowed to be the dead woman defrosting. There is a set of truisms that I often see that I'm sure I will also get in response to this video. Women can be evil, and women can be villains. As if that reveals anything new or groundbreaking. The story of Genesis shows women as a corrupting force of humanity, and that informed the subsequent treatment of women in the Middle Ages and beyond as having some essence of evil. But sure, I agree, let them be evil, but let them be complicated in their villainy. Let them undergo and inhabit their transformation in or out of villainy. Let them redeem themselves, heal and grow, and at least sometimes let them win, because whenever we encounter female villains, We do not assume them to be worthy of redemption or healing. They are only worthy of dying. The other truth I often hear is, women can be tragic. Once more, sad, shocking, and realistic does not equal tragic. Tragedy has a structure, and none of these women meet the structure of tragic protagonists. None of them died because of their fatal flaws. They die so that a man or the audience can be sad, shocked, or vindicated, and often not because they were intended to be tragic, but because the writers couldn't imagine them having any other future. Most of these women are very different from one another. They have different personalities, goals, backstories, motivations. They inhabit fantastical and regular worlds. Some are queer and some are straight, some are white and some are women of color. But the one point uniting them all is that their journeys were interrupted by the glass finish line, because we treat women as if their flaws are forever and their fates are predestined. Because we still have a problem with seeing women not as characters, but as narrative resources. But I want to see female villains win. I want to see female villains be redeemed. I want to see women change the world and live in that changed world. I want women to reap the fruits of their labor. I want to see sick, addicted, and mentally ill women heal. I want women's happiness to not be reduced to being barefoot and pregnant. I want messy, good, villainous, complicated, morally grey women. I want women to be able to return, become mistresses of the two worlds, and wield the bounty of the freedom to live. Fundamentally, what I want is for women to be allowed the same scope of experience as male characters, in the stage of departure, in the stage of initiation, and in the stage of the return. Is this really so much to ask for? And yes, I also would like to see a man be fridged every once in a while, as a treat. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider sticking around by subscribing. Likes and comments are also appreciated. And remember, Phoenix rises from the ashes, and ashes stand on top.